Hey everyone, ready to tackle some serious history? Today, we're diving deep into not one, not two, but five major European empires.
Five. Wow.
Yeah, we're talking British, Spanish, French, Dutch, and Portuguese. The ones that pretty much ran the world for a while.
Reshaped the map, you can say. It's a lot to cover.
It is. And we're going to compare them, see what made each tick, what they had in common, where they totally diverged. It's going to be fascinating, I think.
Definitely. Their stories are all intertwined, but each one is unique.
Right. So let's start with the obvious question. Where did these empires even come from? How did they get started? I mean, Spain and Portugal, they were the early birds, right?
Absolutely. The age of exploration. They were driven by that thirst for new trade routes, spices, gold, all that.
Classic. So Spain, they burst onto the scene pretty dramatically, didn't they? Columbus in 1492, the whole 9 yards.
Oh, yeah. It was a whirlwind. They were after gold, silver, spreading Catholicism, the whole package.
And they weren't shy about using force to get what they wanted.
Not at all. Look at what happened with the Aztecs and Incas.
Yeah.
Brutal conquests. But they gained huge chunks of the Americas that way.
Yeah, that's a whole other story for another day. But Portugal, they were different, right? They were
Yeah.
more about those strategic trading posts.
Exactly. Think Vasco da Gama. Reaching India in 1498, that was a game changer.
For them and for everyone else, probably.
Yeah. Less about conquering vast lands, more about controlling the flow of trade, securing key ports along those spice routes. Super valuable.
So Spain's more about brute force. Portugal's playing a more subtle game.
You got it. And those different approaches really shaped their legacies.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got Spain and Portugal kicking things off. Now, what about the British? They weren't exactly wallflowers, but they came in a little later.
Yeah, they were initially focused on, countering the Spanish.
Rivals from the start, it seems.
Pretty much. But their approach was different. They used these chartered companies. The British East India Company is a prime example.
Ah, these companies were like empires within the empire.
Right. They had their own armies, navies. They were basically mini governments. And that let them gradually gain influence, especially in places like India.
So less about outright conquest, more about strategic alliances and playing the long game.
Exactly. They were masters of leveraging local power dynamics to their advantage.
Never. Okay, we've covered Spain, Portugal, and Britain. Now, what about France and the Dutch? They jumped into the empire game too, right?
Oh, yeah. They had their own ambitions. The French, they were interesting. They wanted it all. Land and trade.
Ambitious.
They competed with Britain in North America, but they also had those incredibly lucrative Caribbean islands. Sugar was a gold mine.
And the Dutch. Weren't they like the masters of trade?
Yeah.
Especially with those powerful companies like the VOC.
The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, those guys were something else.
Powerful, I bet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They weren't as interested in, conquering vast territories. They wanted to dominate specific markets, control the flow of goods.
Like a global trading powerhouse.
Exactly. They created monopolies, controlled prices, basically dictated terms to entire regions.
Wow. Okay, so we've got Spain focused on conquest, Portugal on those trade routes, Britain playing the long game, France wanting it all, and the Dutch mastering the art of the trade monopoly. So 5 empires, 5 different formulas.
Leads to a pretty interesting world map, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Speaking of which, let's do a little global tour. Where did all these empires actually plant their flags?
Yeah.
Spain, they went big in.
The Americas, Mexico, big parts of South America, even the Philippines, way over in Asia.
Wow. Yeah, they really did cover a lot of ground. And Portugal, besides Brazil, which we all know about, they had those key trading posts, right?
Oh, yeah. Places like Goa in India, Macau, Malacca. Strategically placed to control the flow of spices, silk, all those valuable goods between East and West.
Smart. Now, the British Empire, they were just about everywhere, weren't they?
It's kind of mind-boggling how much territory they controlled. North America, huge parts of India, which they called the jewel in the crown, Australia, parts of Africa. Their reach was incredible.
Yeah, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. Okay, so the British, they were the global superpower. What about the French? Their holdings were a bit more scattered, right?
They were. But they had some key territories, Canada, of course, which they called New France, but also some Caribbean islands. And they had a presence in Africa and Southeast Asia.
Diverse portfolio, I guess you could say. And last but not least, the Dutch. Their empire was a bit more focused, wasn't it?
Yeah. Their most valuable possession, by far, was Indonesia. The Dutch East Indies, they called it back then. They also had some territories in South Africa, a few Caribbean islands, but Indonesia was the crown jewel.
Gotcha. So we've got a sense of who went where. But what about the money? How did these empires actually generate all that wealth? I mean, Spain, weren't they all about that New World gold and silver?
Early on, yeah, they shipped tons of precious metals back to Europe. But it's funny, all that gold and silver, it actually caused some problems.
Oh, how so?
Inflation, too much of a good thing, you know? It's a classic example of how an empire's actions can have these unintended consequences.
Makes sense. So, Spain's early wealth, it was tied to those precious metals. But Portugal, they were all about the spice trade, right?
Spices were huge, especially early on. They controlled key points along those trade routes, bought low in Asia, sold high back in Europe, but they also diversified. Brazil became a major source of income thanks to sugar plantations.
Ah, sugar. That's a whole other story too, right? The slave trade, the plantations.
Yeah, unfortunately. And the British Empire, they were deeply involved in the slave trade as well, especially in their Caribbean colonies.
Right. It's a dark chapter in their history for sure. But speaking of the British, they were known for their industrial might, weren't they? How did their colonies contribute to that?
Think raw materials, cotton from India, North America, tea from China, spices from across the globe. Their colonies were a vital source of everything they needed to fuel the Industrial Revolution back home.
So while Spain's dealing with their gold and silver boom, the British are building this industrial powerhouse, fueled by goods from their empire. Interesting contrast. What about the French? What were their main moneymakers?
Their Caribbean colonies were key. Sugar, coffee, those were huge. They also made a lot of money from the fur trade in North America, especially through their relationships with indigenous peoples.
And finally, the Dutch, those masters of commerce. What were their key commodities?
Spices were still their bread and butter. They created these monopolies, controlled production, and drove up prices back in Europe.
So Spain's got their gold and silver, Portugal's got their spices and sugar, the British have their raw materials, the French have their sugar, coffee, and furs, and the Dutch are still dominating the spice game. It's fascinating how each empire had its own economic engine.
Engines that weren't always running smoothly, I might add.
Right, they were constantly evolving, influenced by things like global demand, competition, and even struggles within the colonies themselves. Which makes me wonder, how did these economic models ultimately contribute to their rise and fall? And what lasting impacts did they have on the world? Those are some big questions.
Big questions indeed, and ones we'll tackle in our next deep dive. Welcome back. Last time, we were exploring how these empires got started, how they grew, their different strategies, how they made their money. It's a lot to keep track of.
5 empires.
Yeah.
That's a lot. But it's fascinating stuff. I mean, they basically reshaped the world.
No doubt about it. They left their mark everywhere. But as we all know, empires don't last forever. So today, we're talking about their decline. What brought them down? And, what can we learn from their downfall?
It's kind of hard to imagine, right? These empires, once so powerful, eventually fading away. Where do we even begin?
Well, it's usually not just one thing. It's a mix of factors, right? Over-reliance on certain resources, costly wars, internal struggles, the rise of independence movements. It's complicated.
Right, empires are complex.
Yeah.
So let's start with Spain. They were the first to really rise to prominence, but their decline seems pretty dramatic. What happened there?
Remember how their early economy was so tied to gold and silver from the Americas?
Oh yeah, they were swimming in it,
Mm-hmm.
at least for a while.
Exactly. But that dependence, it became a problem. It led to inflation, a lack of investment in other industries, and eventually economic vulnerability.
So they put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Pretty much. And when that source of wealth started to dry up and other empires started competing, they weren't really equipped to adapt.
It's like a boom and bust cycle, but on an imperial scale.
Exactly. And those constant wars Spain was fighting, those didn't help either.
Drain their resources, I mean.
Oh, yeah. Maintaining a vast empire across the globe, incredibly expensive. The military campaigns, the administration, it all added up.
And then there's the whole resentment factor. Centuries of conquest and, let's be honest, forced assimilation. That probably created some tension.
You think, by the 19th century, those tensions boiled over into full-blown independence movements across Latin America.
So Spain's decline, it was a perfect storm. Economic woes, military overreach, and the inevitable backlash against colonial rule.
A cautionary tale, for sure. It shows how even the mightiest empires can be brought down by internal weaknesses and external pressures.
Makes you think. Okay, what about Portugal? Their decline seems a bit less dramatic than Spain's, but still significant.
It was more gradual, for sure. But they faced similar challenges. Overdependence on certain resources, competition from rivals, and unrest in their colonies. It all adds up.
And of course, they lost Brazil in 1822. That must have been a major blow.
It was. It marked the end of Portugal's era as a global power, really. They held on to some African colonies for a while longer, but their days of dominating trade routes were over.
Interesting how both Spain and Portugal, the pioneers of exploration, they were ultimately unable to maintain their empires.
The world was changing. New powers were rising. The old models of empire just weren't sustainable anymore.
Times change, right? Okay, let's shift gears to the British Empire. They were the ones that seemed to be everywhere at their peak. How did they start to lose their grip?
World War I was a major turning point for them. It exposed the vulnerabilities of their vast empire, fueled nationalist sentiments in their colonies.
Right, those wars, they were incredibly costly in terms of lives and resources.
Exactly. It put a huge strain on them, revealed the cracks in their imperial facade.
And those cracks just got wider after World War II. The world was a different place.
It was. The age of European colonialism was coming to an end.
And India gaining independence in 1947, that was a huge moment.
It was. It really signaled the beginning of the end for the British Empire. India's independence, led by figures like Gandhi, Nehru, it was a watershed moment, inspired other colonies around the world to fight for their own freedom.
It's incredible how those movements for independence really reshaped the map, changed the balance of power.
It really shows the power of ideas, the human desire for self-determination. It's a powerful thing.
Yeah, it really is. So the British Empire, like the Spanish and Portuguese before them, ultimately couldn't hold on.
They couldn't escape the forces of history. Their decline was complex, of course, but the rising tide of nationalism was a major factor.
Okay, so what about the French? They held on to their colonies for a while, didn't they?
They did, but they faced their own challenges. The loss of Haiti, for example.
Right, the Haitian Revolution, early 1800s.
That was a major blow. It was a powerful symbol of resistance against colonial rule. Showed that even the most entrenched empires could be challenged.
And they faced other challenges too, right?
Oh, yeah. Algeria, Vietnam. Nationalist movements were gaining momentum all over the world.
So even though they had a slightly different approach, maybe less overtly exploitative than some others, they still couldn't hold on in the end.
The era of European colonialism was drawing to a close, and no amount of military might or political maneuvering could change that.
And finally, the Dutch. Their empire was already on the decline by the time World War II came around, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had lost some key territories, mainly due to conflicts with, the British. And then after World War II, Indonesia, their most valuable colony, finally achieved independence.
So by the mid-20th century, all 5 of these empires, once so dominant, they were basically shadows of their former selves.
It's amazing, isn't it? The rise and fall of empires. From controlling vast swathes of the globe to grappling with decline and the loss of their colonies. It's quite a story.
It really is.
Right.
But it's not over yet, right? Their legacy lives on in all sorts of ways.
Absolutely. Both positive and negative, I'd say. And that's what we'll explore in our final part. What impact did these empires have on the world? How do their actions, both good and bad, continue to shape our lives today?
Welcome back for the final leg of our Empire Marathon. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? From those early days of exploration to the rise and fall of these massive empires.
It has. And now we're at the part where things get really interesting, I think. Unpacking their legacies. How did these empires shape the world? How do their actions, good and bad, still affect us today?
Because they do, right. I mean, even centuries later, their fingerprints are everywhere. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. And sometimes it's hard to even see it, how deeply embedded it is.
Okay, so where do we even begin? What are some of the most obvious, most enduring legacies of these empires?
Well, language, for sure.
Yeah.
Think about how many people speak English or Spanish today. That's a direct result of these empires.
Yeah, it's incredible. English, thanks to the British Empire, it's like the global language now, isn't it? Business, science, internet, everything.
Pretty much. It connects people across continents, even if their countries were once, on opposite sides of colonial lines. And Spanish, thanks to the Spanish Empire's presence in the Americas, it's another incredibly influential language.
And Portuguese too, right? Brazil, Angola, Mozambique.
Exactly. So those empires, through their conquests and colonization, they spread their languages, and that shaped communication culture for centuries.
It's like they created this invisible infrastructure.
I like that, invisible infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it's not just language, of course. Religion's another powerful legacy. The Spanish and Portuguese, they were driven by Catholicism. They actively tried to convert people.
Right. I mean, look at Latin America. It's predominantly Catholic today, directly because of Spanish missionary work.
Exactly. And the British Empire, while they weren't as explicitly focused on conversion, they still had a big impact on, the religious landscape.
They were more pragmatic, weren't they? Like,
Yeah.
as long as you don't threaten our rule, you can practice your religion.
Yeah, more about control than conversion, I guess. And that tolerance, or maybe pragmatism, contributed to the religious diversity we see in places like India or Nigeria today.
So language, religion, it's amazing how much they shaped the spiritual beliefs and practices of, what, billions of people?
Yeah. It's a lot to think about.
It is. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Economics.
Hmm.
These empires, they were all about the money, right?
Hmm.
But they went about it in very different ways.
Totally. And those differences, they've had a lasting impact on how the global economy works, on trade patterns, financial systems.
I mean, Spain, with their obsession with gold and silver, they kind of set the stage for global trade, didn't they?
In a way, yeah. I mean, all that gold and silver flowing into Europe, it had huge consequences. It fueled economies, sparked inflation, and even financed other empires.
Wild. And Portugal, with their control of the spice trade, they were like the masters of seafaring commerce, connecting Europe to Asia, all those valuable goods.
They were. Their emphasis on trade, on controlling those routes, it had a lasting impact. You can see it in the global trade networks that exist today.
Right. And the British, they took a more diverse approach, I guess, using their colonies for raw materials, markets for their finished goods.
Yeah, and their navy. Don't forget the navy. They were masters at using their empire to fuel their industrial growth. The British Empire and the Industrial Revolution, they're intertwined.
Right, right. Okay, so what about the French and the Dutch? What were their economic legacies?
The French, with their sugar plantations in the Caribbean, the fur trade in North America, they were big players too. Though their reliance on slave labor, it's a dark part of their legacy. Can't forget that.
Definitely not.
Mhm.
And the Dutch, with their powerful trading companies, weren't they kind of the pioneers of the multinational corporation?
Yeah, you could say that. Their focus on efficiency, profit, it shaped how business is done today.
So these empires, in their quest for wealth, they left their mark on, well, pretty much everything. Trade, finance, the very nature of capitalism itself.
Big stuff. And these legacies are still being debated. Globalization, free trade, inequality. These issues are connected to the actions of those empires.
Okay, so we've talked language, religion, economics. What about their political legacies? How did they shape the way we govern ourselves?
Their impact on political systems, legal frameworks, it's huge. It still influences countries all over the world.
The British, for example, they spread their parliamentary system, their legal traditions.
And those systems, adapted and modified over time. They're still the foundation for countries like India, Canada, Australia.
And the French, with their emphasis on centralized power, secularism, they influenced their former colonies, especially in West Africa.
Their influence is also visible in debates about the role of religion in government, that separation of church and state. It's a big topic.
And the Spanish and Portuguese, with their strong Catholic ties, they really shaped Latin America.
Their legacy is still felt in debates about social justice, inequality, the role of the church. Those conversations are ongoing.
So these empires, each in their own way, they really shaped the political DNA of the world.
They did, and it's important to remember that.
Absolutely. But we can't talk about legacies without acknowledging the dark side of things. Their pursuit of wealth and power came at a huge human cost.
You're right. Colonialism, slavery, exploitation, those are inseparable from the more positive aspects we've discussed. Millions of people suffered, and the consequences are still being felt.
The slave trade, for example, a horrific chapter in human history.
And colonialism itself. Forced displacement, assimilation, exploitation. It created inequalities, resentment that continue to fuel conflict today.
Right. It's a complex and painful legacy, but one we have to confront.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's crucial to remember that these empires, as powerful and influential as they were built on exploitation. They were ultimately unsustainable.
They were, but their stories, they teach us a lot about human history, the interconnectedness of different cultures, the desire for freedom. It's a lot to take in.
It is. We've seen how their actions, for better or worse, shaped the world we live in. From the languages we speak to the systems we live under, their influence is undeniable. So to our listeners, as you go about your day, think about those invisible threads. How are you connected to these empires? How did they impact your life?
It's all around us.
It is. And it reminds us that history isn't just something in textbooks. It's a living force that shapes our present, our future. Thanks for joining us on this epic journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the past.